And good evening to you all, and very welcome to our last day. And yes, I have the pleasure of introducing Erik Goodwyn for our plenary today with the title The Illusion and Imagination in Psyche and Storytelling. Erik is a psychiatrist who has listened to the dreams and fantasies of suffering people in both the military and civilian settings. He's a veteran and a scholar, published in anthropology, in dream analysis, mythology, ritual, philosophy, and archetypal psychology. Erik's been invited to give lectures globally and internationally, including Ireland and Switzerland, Germany, and of course, the United States. His passion is the imagination in all its manifestations, which is why he's also the author of fantasy fiction. And he feels the symbolic and the fantastical imagery of the imagination is the only way to depict some of the most important and mysterious truths of the human soul, as depicted in his Raven's Tales series. So it is great pleasure to welcome Erik, and we look forward to the presentation today. Thank you. Thanks. Erik, over to you.
Thank you. So going to get a little bit of a taste of the March 15th talk on why are Jungians doing so much writing and other art. I actually kind of got roped into this talk by Dragana after she read my novel. And we had a nice talk about it. She really liked it a lot and thought I could do a talk about the distinction that I'm making between illusion and imagination. This is the distinction I think most of you here will be quite familiar with, but I'm coming at it from an angle that maybe you might not have thought of. So hopefully it'll be useful. It was a part of the writing process, but also, of course, very useful in therapy. And it's actually interesting. The more that I do this, the more I realize how much of what we find in therapy and exploring the psyche, how much of that applies to artistic expressions, particularly novel writing, at least in my case, but I think it applies to all the arts, most likely. Not having experience in those other arts, I can't say for sure, but I strongly suspect. So the distinction that I'm making here requires some definitions, and I'll start with the imagination. And what I'm talking about when I say imagination is primarily that of spontaneous imagery and narratives that emerge unbidden into the mind. And as it turns out, there's a lot of science behind this. A lot of this can be boiled down in terms of the science here in asking a question, what is the biological function of the psyche? And from my own background in biosciences, that's where I typically start, but then I move out to wherever it goes and wherever it takes me. Now, you could say that here we're talking about the brain, which is a good place to start, so long as you remember that the brain is attached to a body and that body is also attached to the rest of the world. And here we could say, okay, well, let's start with the brain. Like, what is the function of it? And the function, you could argue, would be things like processing of sensory input, internal sensations, like kinesthetic sense, balance, coordination, but also in our species, of course, especially empathy, mentalization, theory of mind, stuff like that. And this is, of course, because our species is intensely social, like many other species, but perhaps more so than any other species. That's probably debatable, but in any case, we know it's very social. Also, maintenance of life functions, modulation of body temperature, stuff like that. But then, of course, executive functions, reasoning, language. So there's a whole lot of functions the brain seems to be doing. Is there some way we can rope that all together into one major overarching function? I do think that you can. And I think that what the brain is generally doing, the common element in all of that stuff, is generating context. And that's primarily from the imagination's point of view. What is the imagination trying to do? It's trying to generate context. It's trying to put it all together. And we'll see what I mean here as I go through a couple of the standard functions. Um, so what what I think is behind all of this, generation of context is another way of saying generating meaning. And I have a very specific way of looking at the concept of meaning. What does meaning mean? Okay. Without being trying to sound too clever by half, what I'm getting at is a meaning is basically putting the coordinates on the point. If you have a point in a coordinate system, say, meaning is what are the numbers that give us the coordinates? Where is it located? What is the context? So how does that point relate to everything else outside that? This you can actually connect to the transcendent function. And the transcendent function, if you'll remember, is what Jung said, a capacity for change in the human soul. Now, what do I do with that? How can I connect that to bioscience or clinical clinical experience? It's an activity that continually strives towards wholeness and integration. It acts continuously through life, bridging the apparent opposites through the formation of symbols to aid in psychic healing and development. That, I argue, is meaning construction. Now, he, against the reductionistic criticisms that he predictably got, would say in response, there's nothing, I'm quoting him here in Eighth Collective Work. There's nothing mysterious or metaphysical about the term transcendent function. It means a psychological function comparable in its own way to the mathematical function of the same name, a function of real and imaginary numbers. This is a really clever way that he's using this concept. The transcendent function arrives from the union of these two things. So what's real and what's imaginary is how he's framing this. And I think that's clever. I think a lot of people probably it went right over their head, but that's Jung for you, you know. Whether that the mathematical analogy clarifies or obscures, I guess you could debate that. I got it, but I have a background in math. But and elsewhere, he says that everything that happens at the behest of nature, unconsciously and spontaneously, that's the key word here, is deliberately summoned forth and integrated into the conscious mind and its outlook expressed in the transcendent function. So what he's saying is that the psyche, and I argue the brain and the body functions connected to it, are all the time in the background working towards this process of regulation and integration. I'm trying to take all of the chaos that comes into me every single day, put it together into some kind of palatable format that the ego can then make sense of and try to do something with. And the imagination is a huge part of this process. But we have to make a distinction here because it is not only possible for the imagination to spontaneously hit us from out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, but we can also direct it ourselves with our conscious egos and the will. We can willfully conjure up a scene, say. But of course, as we know from clinical experience, a lot of times that kind of daydreaming, if you will, is going to be contaminated with ego defenses and ego inflations and all sorts of stuff. Whereas those elements that emerge spontaneously from the psyche, less so. They incorporate those defenses, like if in the case of dreams, for example. But the origin is different. It's not from the ego. So now we're starting to see the distinction here that I'm trying to make, and we'll get to it as we go. It has to be the right kind of imagination. I think part of the problem is the terminology here is a little bit fuzzy because imagination is being used for a lot of different terms. That's why I'm making this distinction here so we can clarify. And the important difference is spontaneously emergent material is the stuff that we look for in therapy and creatives actually utilize, whether they know it or not. As opposed to willfully directed material, which can oftentimes just include ego fantasies and what I'm calling illusions. So what we're getting at today then is the spontaneous content, and we're equating that with the imagination. And later on in the talk here, when I get to what the alchemists did with this, I think you'll see more clearly what I'm getting at. The transcendent function is therefore defined as a nascent property of the psyche. It can be observed in the spontaneous contents, the study of undirected contents of the mind. Now, we know from clinical experience in analytical psychology, and other schools know this too, that this kind of spontaneous content is really useful. It's not random, number one, despite what some folks out there might say. We know better. It's non-random, and it actually is very highly functional and focused. And in fact, this is independently, interestingly enough, confirmed by the research into spontaneous thought. Spontaneous thought is what they label mind wandering is another term you may hear tossed around. Undirected thought, task independent thought. These are the things that have all been called. That's what spontaneous thought has been called in various formats over the last 10, 15 years or so when this research has really started to build up. And mind you, all of this is outside of psychodynamic therapy. This literature tends to be independent of this. And let me just say too, also the notes that I'm using here, I'm going to forward to Dragana, and she can give it to anybody who's interested. There's more in the notes than I'm going to have time to talk about. So, and as well as a list of references too for anyone who's interested. Now, spontaneous thought, according to the researchers into this subject, label it as a mode of mind that appears to have considerable benefit for our day-to-day functioning and general contentment. It affords sense making, ordering of events, anticipation and projections into the future, and it's a starting point for many of our creative ideas. So you can hear in that a lot of what I'm covering today in this duality between illusion and imagination. So the brain, rather than just being this passive reactive organ that responds to internal stimuli and just, has all these sort of knee-jerk reactions layered into it. No, it's not that. It's much, much more sophisticated than that. The genome and the brain and all of these, it's a intrinsically active overall organ and organ system. It's intensely dynamic. It's intensely creative. Even in the absence of input, and there's many ways that this can be shown, even in the absence of input, it will come up with material constantly. Now, Jung and the other depth psychologists of his day recognized this and intuited this early on. And they recognized that spontaneous thoughts of the imagination are not chimerical wish fulfillments. If it's truly spontaneous and coming from the unconscious, it can be those sorts of things, but often it's more in service to the ego. And I'll get it later. We'll get into how we can distinguish these two, and it's pretty useful, I think. What the spontaneous thought of the psyche is doing is focusing on emotionally salient personal concerns, memory consolidation, and future planning. And it's all the time directed at emotionally relevant current concerns, both towards planning and also memory consolidation and identity formation. It's another big piece of this too. It can be associated with dysfunctional processes when in the case of like rumination or OCD, but more often than not, it's not perfect, but then nothing in biology is perfect. But nevertheless, most of the time, it's focusing on integration and self-regulation. And it does it through the construction of narratives, as we'll see. Even though researchers have called this mind wandering or undirected thought, there are some newer thinkers who think we should probably start calling this mind ordering rather than mind wandering, because it may seem like it's wandering, but that's only because it's contents that emerge and independently of what it is that you're doing right now. So this research started when they noticed when we put people into various neuroimaging modalities, and they weren't thinking about anything in particular, the brain settled into this, what they call a default mode network. And the researchers are like, what is going on there? What is the brain doing? You would think it would be doing nothing because they're not focusing on anything. But of course, the brain's never doing nothing. Even when you're asleep, it's during dreaming, your brain is actually more active than it is when it's awake, funny enough. And in terms of like energy consumption. So now psychodynamic folks from way back have already knew this. So we recognize that spontaneous contents, dreams is a big part of this, because dreams are a type of spontaneous thought that is maybe even intensified over the daytime spontaneous thoughts that we can have. And we're taught, of course, as therapists, to attend to our own spontaneous thoughts while in the session. And we'll use those, of course, Jung trained folks to look closely at that. But if you look at the research on dream content, there has been kind of this debate over the years of whether or not dreams are revelatory of deeper processes or they disguise deeper processes. The old Freudian idea of the dream censor, and how is the dream censor is really trying to disguise what's going on. Long story short, you can read the notes here for this, but I think Jung comes out on top with this because he sharply disagreed with Freud on this. In his terms, he said dreams are never diplomatic. They say exactly what they mean. There's no disguising. So the manifest content is now what most dream researchers, again, independently of any psychoanalytic schools, have found in this research. So now this is what I'm equating with the imagination. That's what I'm labeling that as, this type of thought. And funny enough, the imagination then is behind a lot of what is going on in the brain, actually, even to the point of things that we would normally associate it with, like memory, for example. Memory is oftentimes discussed as if our memory worked like a computer memory. We would store events that happened to us in our memory banks, and then they're retrieved later. That's baloney. That's not how memory works. Memory uses the imagination in an active, constructive process. At the point at which you're trying to recall something that happened to you yesterday or 25 years ago, you're not retrieving a thing that happened to you. You're using your imagination to construct more or less what probably happened 5 days ago or 15 years ago. And there's a lot of reasons why we know this at this point. Again, there's more detail in the notes, but what I mean to emphasize here is that the imagination is actually behind our memory, especially autobiographical memory. And what is that? That is a story. Autobiographical memory is a narrative. Now, getting further into this, you can see that also the emotion is what drives this process. Our memories are affected by our current emotional state. Most of us here know this. But why would that be? Well, it's because the process behind it is emotionally focused. And our emotions are basically the puppet masters. They're running the show, right? The ego always thinks it's in charge of things, but no, it's our deeper emotional states that skew pretty much everything in the direction that it needs to go. And that's because the emotions are far more ancient than the structures that correlate with ego consciousness, the frontal lobes, for example. So now here's one of the interesting things. If you look even at the neuroscience of this, you can see that even if you're looking at intracranial electrical stimulation data, for example, this data shows that memory recall, dreaming, imagining, planning, and even hallucinating are all involving the same brain networks. In particular, the hippocampus and the medial temporal lobe, for any of you neuroscience nerds out there, such as myself. So there's a common underpinning in the imaginal process here behind all of these different things. They're connected deeply together. And that may be the piece that you might not be familiar with in the distinction here. This process allows mappings of anything to anywhere, really. That's the power of this ability. And that's connection, which is context formation, which is meaning making. Now, the reason why this probably works like this is that nature and evolution hates to reinvent the wheel. If it's something that's there that works, then but I have need of a new process, then it'll just take whatever is already there and modify it a little bit and tweak it and say, boom, there we go. Okay. For example, um, our uh, our temperature regulation processes were co-opted in very ancient lineage of the mammal line. Our temperature regulation processes that are in the brain were co-opted later to attach significance to our social connections. So um, what I'm saying is that it was the temperature regulation centers of the brain that evolved later into the structures that are correlate strongly with social bonding and social attachment. This is why in dream contents, for example, and even our everyday language, being connected to someone is like associated with warmth. They have a warm smile, they have a warm personality, or on the opposite end, they have a cold shoulder, right? They have a cold outlook. They're icy, that kind of stuff. There's a very real and very biological basis for those symbolic connections. And it's because they're universal experiences that we all have. Okay. And this is all over the place in the brain. Dreaming now, as we know, has been long time tied to memory consolidation by way of rapid eye movement sleep mechanisms. We should note that less than 2% of dream content actually includes an episodic memory. So it's not just regurgitating stuff that happened to us. It's far more sophisticated. It takes what happened to us, breaks it down into tiny fragments, intermingles it with older memories and older characters and other semantic knowledge to construct a brand new narrative that you're having in the dream. And of course, as we know in psychotherapy, those dream narratives are highly significant because they're symbols of your current situation. As it turns out, that Jung was spot on when he said that a dream is a expression of your current situation of the psyche in symbols, right? So that's the key. You have to remember it's symbols. Okay. So the ultimate goal of this process is to construct a narrative because the narrative and a story is the way that we organize information at the highest level. There was I forget who it was, but I think it was a poet said that the universe is not made of molecules, it's made of stories, right? I love that. And this is definitely true of the psyche. It organizes things into stories. This constant imaginative process is a storytelling machine. Although I hesitate to use that term, right? But it's not really a machine, it's alive. It's organic. So maybe an organic process might be a safer word to use. Um, so the the spontaneous thought, now that we're able to connect to goal tracking, planning, creative problem solving, reviewing past experiences, memory consolidation, aligning oneself with goal attainment, occasionally leads to rumination or excessive daydreaming and dissociation, even that can happen. No. Um, that's behind those functions are what's behind this imagination or spontaneous thought, as opposed to ego-driven fantasy narratives, which the ego can use to self-soothe, to service ego inflations, whatever. But it's clearly a different process in that case. What we're finding in this neuroscience research is essentially what Jung was proposing way back when he said there's two centers of the psyche. There's the ego, but there's also the self. And the self is more behind this spontaneous thought and this imaginal process. In other words, the ego has its own ability to hijack this process and create stuff that it wants too. And sometimes they don't work together very well. And as therapy, we try to bring these two pieces together, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works. Okay. Now, funny enough, there is research that shows that when people um, closely attend to their spontaneous thoughts, that can lead to emotional regulation, particularly when it's images that they're focusing on. Let's see. Attending selectively to one's own spontaneous thoughts, not directed by the ego. What is that called? Right. Anyone familiar with Jungian theory knows that's active imagination. They didn't talk about that in this research because they hadn't heard of it. But turns out Jung came up with that and realized how well it worked many years before. Okay, so meaning making then is the dimension of this transcendent function. Something in some of my other work I call the invisible storyteller. So what I'm saying then, I mean, for clarity here, what I'm saying is a significant element of the transcendent function is involved in meaning making through the expression of affect-laden context, often in the form of a narrative. This means that there's a dimension of this function that's always working in the background and can be detected in the contents of spontaneous thought, especially dreams. The aim of this activity is integrating the self-past with the self-present. That's memory consolidation in a way that calibrates you to your future plans and goals, problem solving creativity part. This is accomplished by the production of an autobiographical self-narrative that includes as much context as possible. That is to say, then, it's involved in an affectively oriented meaning and identity creation, or simply an affectively directed context creation. So, illusion and imagination. We've got two sources for inner theater here. How do I differentiate the two? This is a challenge, of course, because I'm trying to get at the spontaneous thought here, not so much the consciously directed thought, in order to get the real rich material there that is sometimes ignored or even defended against by the ego. Jung recognized how this distinction actually goes back much, much further than psychoanalysis, because the alchemists had talked about it for centuries before. Mystics talked about this. What's important here is that we want to clarify this distinction as much as we can so that we can not only use it for therapeutic purposes, but if we're working on creative work of some kind, this is an important distinction to have as well for your creative process. And again, many of those out there that are intensely creative and involved in creative work already know this and will use these techniques involved in incubating things, for example. They know sometimes to just leave a project alone and let the background stuff do its magic. We're now discovering this same principles here in neuroscience and psychoanalytic work. If one of the best works that I've found that talks about this, not with the neuroscience, but just from the therapy and experiential side, is Jeffrey Raff's book, Active Imagination, and his book, Jungian Alchemical Imagination. Fantastic work. Now, what he distinguishes imagination from fantasy, and I don't want to use that word because I'm getting into later about fantasy fiction, and it's using the term in a different way. So I just settled on the word illusion because of how it often misdirects the process that we're trying to get at. So if you are engaged in an active imagination process, if you're either teaching it to others or you're working on it yourself or you're using it for creative effort, you want to know how to differentiate this too. I want to know where what's coming from what. And it's not to say that the ego contents is bad or useless. That's not true. But it has a different flavor. It has a different use than the more deeply derived imagination processes. Now, I actually had a conversation with Jeffrey after reading his book and made a few suggestions that he agreed with to help distinguish these two. He has a couple in his book, but I had a few too, and they merge nicely together. Illusion is often gratifying to the ego. It's often repetitive and it has this sterility to it because it's just the same thing over and over again. It often defends the ego status quo. So if you're observing contents inwardly that has these characteristics, until you develop a sense for whether or not this is willfully directed or not, you can look at it and judge it through these criteria to get a better idea of whether or not this is illusion or imagination. Because the imagination contents is going to more many times be unpleasant. It can be. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. It's often surprising or it feels weird. But it's also it can be very fertile and catalyzing. It explores things beyond the ego position. It doesn't defend the ego status quo. And so those are dead giveaways that you're looking at imagination. Do these distinctions make it perfectly clear? Not always, but they're guides that you can go through as you are going through the process of active imagination. The ego is expanded by interaction with the imagination because it forms new associations that pull past the old ego boundaries. That's the point of the imagination. By contrast, illusions reinforce the status quo. And again, this is not necessarily bad. Sometimes the ego needs reinforcement. Sometimes it needs to go on a flight of ego-directed illusion to kind of re-solidify, like what do I want to contain, right? How can I stay stable, right? So the ego needs stability sometimes. So it can be useful in that context. But unfortunately, it does also reinforce rigidity and it reinforces blinders and defenses that need to go, primitive defenses, for example. So that doesn't help. And we need to be able to look at what's really coming from the imagination. So, and this is a big problem for beginners in active imagination is they'll experience a narrative and they'll go, but did I just make that up or is that actually coming from the unconscious? And this is how you can help sort the wheat from the chaff, as it were. But of course, this is not a replacement for good old-fashioned practice. And now, according to this work, if you're going to try to resolve deep conflicts or ego defense reinforced dysfunction, you're going to need to access the imagination. The illusion is not going to help you here. In those cases, illusion is the enemy. Paracelsus, actually, in describing this process, said, "He who is born in imagination finds out the latent forces of nature, which with the body is mere fantasy and cannot find." Now, he makes this body and mind distinction that I don't agree with, but it's a common one. The body is not the enemy. The body is actually a part of the unconscious and the imagination process. But nevertheless, the principle behind this is watch out for the illusion, seek the imagination. So how do you work with the imagination, right? Once you've gotten that nailed down, what do you do? The first thing, what Raff suggests that you do is receive the information first, right? Attend to it and really kind of soak it in. And then, if you can, try to elaborate on it. What might this have? What other implications might this have? Try to discern the meaning in amplification and amplify the meaning, therefore, with that process. And then respond. That's another important process. Respond with affect, emotion. That has to be a key element here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was some interesting studies that look at intentional attending to spontaneous thought. And this was a study, a review article, where they looked at different studies that showed that if you intentionally attend to spontaneous thought, it has a mood regulating function. So again, this is independently confirming Jung's technique of active imagination. I would also argue that this is a huge part of many types of hypnotherapy, particularly Ericksonian and base. Because what you're doing is you're helping someone attain a mental state that is slightly dissociated and therefore independent and more objective that helps them to gaze at this material and amplify it and access it, really. Okay. Now, one important caveat to this group of studies was that it's the image-heavy content that seemed to be more effective at mood regulation rather than just verbal descriptions. They found only when studies imagined first-person image-heavy scenarios did their mood actually improve, regardless of whether the scenario was positive or negative. Isn't that interesting? So these researchers concluded then that the specific kinds of deliberate mind wandering or attention to spontaneous thought can improve mood, performance, and a sense of personal meaning. So again, here we are with that. Paracelsus described a process very analogous to this. He called it meditation, which he defined as the name of an internal talk of one person with another who is invisible, as in the invocation of the deity, or communion with oneself, or with one's good angels. Okay, so a dialogue with an inner figure is what I think modern therapists would say. Elsewhere, he says it's necessary that you should know what can be accomplished by a strong imagination. It penetrates and ascends into the superior heaven, passes from star to star. A strong imagination is the cause of both good and evil fortune. Jung, inspired by this, summarized in his words that the imagination is a concentrated extract of the life forces, both physical and psychic. I love that quote. So I think he's spot on there. According to Raff, active imagination transforms the latent self into the manifest self. In his work, he makes this distinction, and I think it's a good one. Illusion, however, can lead to stagnation and ego inflation. So that's a little bit dangerous there. Archetypes encountered during this process can be initially very powerful, but even isolated entities of the psychic energy. But active imagination helps these archetypes to become organized around the self to help towards development. The characters of this process tend to be metaphors for life events, but beyond that, they're symbolic expressions of states of consciousness and felt visions that are unique in themselves. Inner figures have their own voice and consciousness, in other words. So this finding, again, independently confirms and is independently confirmed in the work of Ericksonian hypnotherapy, which describes this ego-attuned mental state and therapeutic trance engaging with the contents of consciousness that spontaneously emerge in that state. And of course, it's very well known to analytical psychology. Now, so here's the 7 steps of active imagination then that help with this process. One is preparing. It's reducing the discursive thoughts. It's essentially a self-induced trance. Second is you invite the process to emerge and develop by way of an image of some kind. It can be a location or something that has meaning for you, but you're basically wanted to use it as a crystal, as a seed for a crystal to form around. In third stage, the unconscious response. It animates the image. It builds stuff around it. It goes whatever direction it wants to go. Then you interact with it. This process is usually pretty lengthy because the ego has to then engage with it, converse with it, do whatever is appropriate in this interaction. Reflection is a next step. It's taking a step later and going, okay, what was going on when I did that? What was going on during that interaction process? How does that connect with my external life experience? Because it will be connected. It's not, remember, it's not random. It's not just wish fulfillments. It's not meaningless. It's directed at meaning making. And it's helpful in that sense. The next stage is resolution. This is a shift that is basically caused by the work of the transcendent function and cannot be rushed. You just cannot rush this. And oftentimes people will get impatient with it that I've worked with. And they have to be stopped and say, look, you're trying to rush the growth of a tree, and the tree grows the way it wants to grow. And that's just, you just got to deal with it. And then finally, integration is where you use the insights that you've gained through this whole process and you bring it forth into your life. And it can be very, very healing. Now, as the last part of this here, I'm going to talk about how this connects to creative work. Um, it should come as no surprise that creatives like artists, writers, actors, and others have found this kind of thing very useful. And they have contributed to the conversation as well. In the literature on spontaneous thought, there are artists and other, various creatives who have chimed in on this process because they know what is going on. They do it all the time. Jungian therapy, of course, has a long tradition of encouraging creative work for this very reason. I think this this research even tells us maybe even more why this is so useful. Whereas before it's just sort of accepted on faith that we should do this, but now we know, I think, have a better idea of why it actually works. We already knew that it worked, but now we know why. Engaging with spontaneous thought or the imagination, if you will, whether it's an active imagination or sand play or artistic endeavors, can continue to spur integration, self-regulation, the acquisition of deeper insights. My creative work was in fantasy fiction writing. I've been doing it for a long time. For many years, I sucked at it. I was really terrible, but it's a skill just like anything else, and you can get better with it if you practice. But I tried never to lose track of the fact that what we're doing when we're making a creative piece of art or work or story or whatever is engaging with the imagination, and we're not just directing it all with the ego. I think, in fact, that fantasy, the genre of fantasy, which Jungians have a lot of familiarity with due to their engagement with folk tales and myths, is a very powerful playground to create in. Um, Now, fantasy is sometimes pigeonholed as genre fiction, and I believe it has a special, but I believe it has a special place among the genres. In fact, I can't say that my opinion on this better than Terry Pratchett did when posed with the same question. When someone asked him, and he's a famous fantasy author, if you're not familiar with who Terry Pratchett was, um, he he was the interviewer posed the question of like, isn't fantasy just silly genre work? It's just nothing serious. It's just for kids and that kind of thing. And he said, without a doubt, the first fiction ever created was fantasy. Guys sitting around the fire telling each other stories about gods who made lightning. They did not tell one another literary stories. They did not complain about difficulties of male menopause while being a junior lecturer on some Midwestern college campus. No, fantasy is the literature. It's the spring from which all other literature has flown. Up to a few hundred years ago, no one would have disagreed with this because most stories were, in some sense, fantasy. In the Middle Ages, people would not have thought twice about bringing death as a character who would have had a role to play in the story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest works of literature, and by the standard which we apply now, is the big muscular guy with swords and godlike connections. That's fantasy. The Kalevala, Beowulf, Bhagavad Gita, all of these stories are fantasy stories. So now, in using his characteristic humor, he says fantasy can carry a serious burden, and humor can do the same. But what you're saying is if you strip away the trolls and dwarves and put everyone into modern dress, get them to agonize a bit, mention Virginia Woolf a few times, and poof, you've got a serious novel. But I don't actually have to believe that. So anyway, is he right about this? I think so. I think it's because the power of metaphors, just in general, with the process of spontaneous thought, amplifies and condense and catalyze affect and action, symbols. And Jung, of course, was very aware of this. And the fantasy genre, I think, has the advantage that other genres don't have because the symbolization is without restriction. A grounded story can still have a potent metaphorical narrative of inner dynamics, but it will be limited in how precise the symbols can be because you have to obey the laws of logic and physics in a grounded type story. In a fantasy, these restrictions are lifted. Of course, you can write a fantasy which is largely just ego illusion, and there's a lot of that crap out there, unfortunately. And I think that's why that type of fantasy gets labeled as pulp. Raff puts it this way: through the imagination, it is possible to perceive the spiritual realms that transcend the psyche. Even in the older imaginal traditions of Sufis and shamans, these spiritual realms were explored and mapped, but our culture remains woefully ignorant of them. I think though that the fantasy genre of fiction writing, however, is one of the most popular genres because it still attempts, at least on some level, to tap into this. Now, Dragana asked me to talk about my novel. It's a little bit here at the end. She read it, enjoyed it a lot, which I'm very grateful for her help on that. It's called King of the Forgotten Darkness. It's available on the 1st of April next year, not long after our talk with the other Jungian artists in the crowd. I used active imagination a lot to come up with the setting and the plot and the characters and the details. I also intentionally layered in symbolism on top of that, but it's not necessary to recognize the symbolism to enjoy the story. I had a lot of readers tell me they loved it, but when then I asked them more about just probing questions like, did you get it? They didn't, but that's okay. That's okay. They still enjoyed the story, and I think the unconscious gets it. And towards this end, essentially what I was attempting to do was to create a healing narrative. It involves trauma, and it involves facing one's inner demons and all that kind of stuff that we're very familiar with in our work here, particularly when you work with dream material. Being a fantasy story means that I can take interactions with inner figures and make it on a more concrete and tangible level in the story. If a person is facing an inner demon in metaphor, in a fantasy story, you can make them actually face the demon in the physical space of the narrative. Now, I think though, and I've written way more nonfiction than fiction, and I think the reason is because fiction is way more difficult. At least it is for me, because you have a captive audience in nonfiction. They want to learn stuff. Fiction, on the other hand, you've got to convince them that your story is going to entertain them and be fun. That's a whole lot harder. But um, if you focus your creative work on creating a ripping good yarn, then but you maintain that connection to the imagination, I think that is one of the keys to generating a work of art that is genuinely compelling and hopefully lasting. As far as the notes go, I've got links in there that you can go to see if you're interested in the story. It's about a character who lives in there's two worlds in this story. One of which is a near future world where there's no war or suffering and people can take drugs whenever they want if they feel sad, and it makes the pain go away. And the other world is you have to go through a magical portal, and it's this world of magic and demons and monsters and dragons and war and chaos. And it's one character's journey from the first world. He has to go back into the magical world in order to save a family member who is still there. So, in any case, I wanted to make this distinction, I think, between illusion and imagination because I think it's a very useful one. It's in many contexts. It's not just in dream and therapy, dream interpretation and therapy, but creative work. And I think to spiritual work, which I don't have a chance to get into too much today, but yeah. So again, anyone who's interested in the notes, Dragana will have a copy of them, and I'm open to questions at this point.
Great, thank you so much, Erik. I'm just going to stop the recording and then we can have a few questions before we